That looks great. This is exactly what I want. What mode is this? Hey guys, Omar here, and today I'm going to show you how to run and gun with your Sony a6400. What are the settings if you just want to turn the camera on and record without worrying too much about exposure, and you just got to capture something quickly, either yourself talking or maybe something is going on. All right, so right now I'm in my home office. I'm holding the a6400 as steady as I can. I'm using this awesome little Manfrotto tripod, which I love, and my arm hurts. All right, so here are my recommended run and gun video settings for the a6400, and this also works with other cameras too, but this is what I'm using. First, if you don't have an ND filter, an ND filter is kind of like sunglasses for your lens. So if you don't have sunglasses for your lens, here are the settings that I use. The first thing is we want to go to, in our exposure mode, we want it to be shutter priority. And the reason is because we don't want our shutter speed to be too high in video, because we actually want, unlike our photographs, we actually want a little bit of blur so that things look realistic and have a little bit of motion to them. If the shutter speed's too high, you get what's called video judder, which kind of is unnerving. But look at the judder and the jelly. Okay, so I have my shutter speed at 1/50th because that's double my frame rate. What that means is I'm shooting at 24 frames a second, so that makes my shutter speed around 1/50th of a second. And by the way, you can cheat. It doesn't have to be exact. You can shoot video at 1/125th of a second, and you probably won't notice the difference too much. Or even 1/30th of a second, you probably won't notice the difference too much. Since this is a run and gun setting, I want the camera to take care of white balance, so you can set auto white balance. I have found, however, that the camera will shift the white balance a bit, so that could be distracting in your video. So I would recommend setting a temperature, an actual temperature. And if you don't want to change things too much and you'll be outside, I would just pick a temperature around 4800 for a cooler look, up to 51 to 5400K. Like I said, I'm shooting 4K, 24 frames a second, and the reason for that is there's no crop in this mode. So I like to use the entire sensor, the entire view. If you shoot at 30 frames a second, you're going to get a little bit of a crop. And with the no ND filter, I set my ISO to be auto ISO. However, you should customize your ISO to have a limit that you're comfortable with. If you move indoors and your ISO is going to like 128,000 and you get grainy video, if that makes you nervous, then set a limit. Set a limit for 3200, 6400. Now in this run and gun setting, the camera will adjust exposure itself. It will look at the scene. And by the way, my metering mode is just the default matrix, or it's called multi. It just takes an overall metering of the scene and will adjust your video accordingly. Now, just be careful, because depending on what your outcome is, like this is for home movies or just recording myself. If you're doing something more professional, I would not use this run and gun setting. You should really dial in all your settings manually. Just keep that in mind. But here the camera will adjust its exposure. Just know that sometimes it's a little delayed. So you sometimes get the camera that it'll like be like, oh, it's too dark, let's make it brighter. And so there's a little bit of a delay that could be distracting depending on what your final outcome is, okay? Just keep that in mind. And if you're not happy with what the metering is doing, sometimes if you're near a window or if there's a computer screen in the background, you're going to have to use exposure compensation. Meaning if the camera sees like a bright window in the back, it's going to take that into account. So set your dial to have exposure compensation. I use the thumb wheel. So set your custom button to be the thumb wheel. If you press down on my thumb wheel, it will give me exposure compensation. And that's one way to adjust your video. Program auto. So here, the camera will pick a shutter speed and an aperture for you. Now here's what's cool is Sony used a little bit of magic to tell the camera that we're doing video and not photography. So what's cool about that is we're gonna add some light here. if your exposure changes, like if the scene gets brighter, then the camera will not increase the shutter speed. What it does instead is it messes with ISO and also with aperture here, okay? So let's try that again. Give you some light there. You notice the ISO goes down to 100. Oops, the ISO goes down to 100, but we stay around 1/50th, 1/60th. So the camera is programmed to know that it's video. Now, if you do have an ND filter, things get you got a lot more control. So here are my recommendations if you do have an ND filter. First of all, your exposure mode will be completely manual. And the good thing about this is you can set the shutter speed to set to 1/50th as well, just like the shutter priority. And the great thing is you can set your aperture to your desired look. If you want the background to be blurry, you could set it to, I have f3.5 listed here because I have the kit lens, and that's the widest it goes. That's as much bokeh as I'm gonna get. But if you have a 1.4 lens, nice, and you want that look, you can set it to 1.4 and it's locked in forever. You can either go with auto ISO, but I recommend, again, the camera in auto ISO will sometimes change ISOs on you. So plug in an ISO, either a general one like for ISO 400, which is kind of a good outdoor indoor, or if you're definitely going to be outside all the time, 100, 200, indoor 800, even 1600. Set something that you can lock it in. All right, now I'm in full manual mode. I have a shutter speed set, 1/50th. I have the aperture, the lowest it goes, 3.5, and I just set a arbitrary ISO, 800. Now for run and gun, I don't want to go from outside to inside and have to change dials. So the best way is to get a variable neutral density filter. And the way these guys work is you actually twist them to set how much light they block. And what's great about that is your settings don't change. That means the Spider-Man sign back there will always be blurry if I stay in the spot. If I'm like vlogging and all of a sudden the sun comes out, I could just change my exposure with this guy. Let me show you. It's on, but it's dark because the neutral density filter is kind of like sunglasses. So what I need to do is raise my ISO just a bit. So let's raise it a bit so you could see me. Oh my God, I'm so bright. Yeah, real bright. I just stopped the video. So now what's cool is you can change your exposure by twisting the neutral density filter. So if it gets too bright, you could be like, you see that? You could just fix it by a quick twist. So you could be talking, and if all of a sudden it gets a little darker, you could let in a little bit more light. You see that? So just with a quick twist of the neutral density filter, you can run and gun video by picking manual settings that make sense for the environment, and then the neutral density filter adjustments are really quick if you want to go dark, light, yeah. Isn't that great? And so this is my favorite way to go, because you get the most consistent exposure that doesn't jump around in too many auto modes. You are kind of the auto mode. You can look up on the screen and see if your exposure is good. You can twist the little ND filter to set your exposure. So if you do have an ND filter, that's my favorite run and gun setting if you're filming yourself. And the neutral density filter I'm using is called Gobe. Anyway, it looks really good, works great. I'll put a link below if you want to check it out. But it's a great accessory to have for run and gun video, switching your exposure quickly. And if you want to disappear, you could be like, yeah, see ya.